Hello and welcome. I'm happy you could join me for this presentation. The original aim of this presentation was to convey the essence of the Buddha's teaching to a dear friend of mine. I'm sharing it here with the wish that it may also help others. The Buddha showed us the way to uncover a hidden perspective so that we could live in peace and happiness here and now. He showed us how we could be free from mental pain and live with ease in this very life. This is his teaching. Before I begin, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to the Buddha for this beautiful teaching, to the Dhamma for its amazing qualities, one of which is the quality of being inviting for one to come and see, to investigate for oneself. And to the Sangha, the monks, nuns, and the members of the lay community, both female and male, who have preserved and protected this teaching by understanding it, practicing it, and sharing their knowledge and insight for the benefit of others. Without the sermons, books, and discussions of these Dhamma teachers, this presentation would have not been possible. I also want to thank my friends and family from many parts of the world for providing helpful comments and suggestions that enabled me to make this presentation to what I am about to share with you. Preparing this presentation has been harder than preparing for my PhD dissertation defense. So I want to thank everyone who made this presentation possible from the bottom of my heart. With that said, let's begin. This presentation is divided into 5 parts. My recommendation is for you to go through this one part at a time. There is a lot of information in each part, so it would be best to take breaks in between each part for an optimal experience. The Buddha's teaching is an analysis of the person and the person's experiences. I will take a step-by-step and graduated approach in this presentation. Just like opening up a lotus flower, we will start with the outer layer with what we can relate to easily. This approach is for the benefit of those who may not have had much exposure to the teaching. And then we will go deeper layer by layer to get to the essence of the teaching. Let's have a look at the organization of topics. In part 1, we will look at what makes up a person and a person's world or the person's experiences. Then in part 2, we will have a look at how a person interacts with the person's world and how the principle of dependent arising relates to this. And then in part 3, we will look at a person's interpretation of these experiences. And in part 4, we will look at the tools the Buddha gave us to investigate our world. And part 4 is divided into part A, looking at dependent arising and how it applies to the person, and part B, the Four Noble Truths. Now this is where the essence of the Buddha's teaching lies. But before I could get to that essence, I will have to walk you through parts 1, 2, and 3. Then in part 5, we will look at what the Buddha asked us to practice. And this also is broken up into 2 parts. A, looking at the Noble Eightfold Path, and B, some finer points about the practice. In part 1, we will be analyzing a person and a person's experiences into the 5 aggregates. According to what the Buddha taught, the best way to understand the composition of a person and a person's experiences is to analyze them into the 5 aggregates. First, we will look at the analysis of a person before talking about the person's experiences. So the 5 aggregates, known as Panchaskandha in Pali. Now, Pali is the language that the Buddha spoke, and in this presentation, I will include the Pali words in italics, in parentheses, for the benefit of those who are already familiar with the Pali terms. All right, among the 5 aggregates, first we have the material component. That is the organic material body, which is called Rupa in Pali. Then we have the aggregate of feeling, Vedana in Pali, the aggregate of perception, Sanya in Pali, and the aggregate of mental formations, Sankhara in Pali. Sankhara is sometimes translated as volitional constructions or preparations. Now, the term Sankhara is used in many contexts, and we will talk about the other aspects of mental formations in the upcoming parts. For now, in the context of the 5 aggregates, the simplest way to think of them is as thoughts that are triggered by sensory input. Then, as the 5th aggregate, we have consciousness, Vijnana in Pali. So the 5 aggregates are what make up a person. Although the 5 aggregates can be identified, they cannot be separated from one another. They can also be subdivided in many ways. However, there's nothing other than the 5 aggregates that make up a person. The best way to understand the Buddha's teaching is to understand the 5 aggregates and see how they work. Now, if you are familiar with the analysis of a person in terms of consciousness and mentality materiality, we can use this diagram. Here you will see that the 5 aggregates are still represented, but in more detail. So here there are the materiality component and the mentality component, consisting of feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention. Now the last 3 mental factors belong to mental formations, and they are triggered by sensory input. And there is consciousness. Here I would like to note that consciousness cannot exist without mentality materiality, and mentality materiality cannot exist without consciousness. So consciousness and mentality materiality are reciprocally dependent on each other. All right. Now let's look at how a person interacts with the world, or what a person's experiences are. Now we are all familiar with the 5 sense organs, but the Buddha identified a 6th sense organ, and we will have a look at those very quickly now. So we have the eye for seeing, the ear for hearing, the nose for smelling, the tongue for tasting, the body for sensing tactile feelings, tactile sensations, and as the 6th organ, the Buddha identified the mind, with its function being knowing or cognizing. All right. Now let's have a look at the sensory objects that are sensed by the six senses. All right, so for the eye to see, we need visual objects that are made up of color. And then for the ear to hear, we need auditory objects made out of sound or vibrations. And then we have, for the nose to smell, we need olfactory objects made up of smell molecules. Then for the tongue to taste, we need taste objects made out of taste molecules. And then for the body to feel some tactile sensations, we need tactile objects made up of varying degrees of temperature and varying degrees of hardness. And then for the mind to sense something, we need mental objects made of thoughts. So as you can see that all of these sensory objects are made up of materiality or are associated with materiality. For example, we know that thoughts are not tangible material objects, but we need materiality such as neurons, electrical signaling, and neurotransmitters in order to generate thoughts. So there is materiality associated with all these sensory objects. Now let's have a look at how the Buddha analyzed materiality. So the Buddha said materiality can be analyzed into the four great primaries or the four great elements. And these are the earth element, Patavi in Pali, the water element, Apo in Pali, the fire element, Tejo in Pali, and the air element, Vayu in Pali. The four great elements have properties that are inherent to them. The earth element has the property of hardness. The wind element has the property of motion or inflatability. The fire element has the property of temperature. And the water element has the property of fluidity. Then along with these main properties, there are also these sub-properties of color, smell, taste, and nutriment associated with the four great primaries. So the four great primaries are present in all materiality in varying proportions. So our bodies, the food we eat, and everything that is around us is made up of materiality having these characteristics. All right, now let's have a look one more time at the sensory objects very quickly and remind ourselves that they are made up of materiality or associated with materiality. And here I am going to indicate in this presentation these circles to represent a unit of materiality as the basic unit that makes up materiality. All right, so now let's have a look at the analysis of a person in this format which I already introduced to you and add in these units of materiality to this materiality component. All right, now we must remember here that mentality and materiality always exists together. We need mental factors in mentality to realize the properties of materiality, and we need materiality for the mental factors in mentality to arise. So these two, mentality and materiality, are always associated together as they support each other, and that is why we will see mentality, materiality written with a hyphen in between, or written as name and form, or simply referred to as Namarupa in Pali. So here we have added some units once again to indicate materiality. Now, the job of consciousness is to bring out the properties of mentality, materiality, and make us aware that we are sensing something. All right, now let's see what happens when we add in a sensory object. All right, so here we have the materiality component of mentality, materiality, and this would be the organic body, where we have the sense organ and then the sense objects that are receptive to the sense organ will also contain materiality. So the sense object is also a part of the materiality component of the 5 aggregates. So the materiality component of the 5 aggregates is not only the organic body, but also the sense objects that become receptive to the sense organ. As we have indicated here by recognizing that both these components are composed of materiality. And so here I have now added a new word in front of consciousness, sense consciousness, labeled it this way to indicate that each sense organ has a corresponding sense consciousness. So for example, when you are seeing, eye consciousness arises along with the eye organ. And we will look further into this with respect to the remaining sense organs in the next section. This brings us to the end of part 1. Here we analyzed the person and the person's sensory experiences into the 5 aggregates. I hope you will join me for part 2 whenever you are ready. Thank you.